Welcome back. In this series of lessons, we're going to be looking at Python, particularly the programming side. This segment has around 9 lessons. The first 5 will be relevant for both IGCSE and AS level students. The rest of the 4 lessons will be specifically focused towards A2, especially paper 4. Now, if you know the basics of Python, and you know how linear search and binary search and bubble sort and insertion sort work, then you might want to jump into lesson 6 of the series, which begins with object-oriented programming. But if you are looking at AS level coding, if you're looking at IGCSE level coding, or perhaps you don't understand the basics at all for Python, then you might want to start with this lesson, and I'll take you step by step through the entire process. So in this series of lessons, we'll cover the following. The first lesson, this particular one, will focus on print, input, and selection statements. We're then going to move on to loops and arrays. So if you're not sure how loops and arrays work, that lesson is for you. And then finally, with lesson 3, we'll focus on functions and procedures and a bit of string manipulation. After that, we're going to be looking at linear and binary search. We're then going to be looking at bubble sort and insertion sort. And then from lesson 6 onwards, we're going to start looking at the serious stuff, object-oriented programming, classes, things like that. We're going to look at abstract data types, stack, queue, linked list, binary tree, and then we're going to move on to file processing and exception handling before we round everything up with recursion. If you go through this series of 9 lessons, you're going to find paper 4 one of the most easiest exams that you've ever taken, provided you practice the programming techniques that we're going to be discussing. If you're watching this series of videos a day or two before the actual exam, chances are you're going to struggle with this. My suggestion is to maybe have a look at this earlier on in August, September time, then maybe relook at some of these techniques around January before your mock exams perhaps, and then once again in around March, April time, and you are going to walk into the exam very confident. You won't even need to revise for the exam because this is one of those exams where you will know it all. The average mark in my last couple of years has been around 65 for all the students that have taken paper 4. And I hope this series of videos will help you attain the same mark. So let's begin by looking at Python in particular. What is Python? Well, Python is a case-sensitive language. What does that mean? That means that you've got to be very careful on how you spell your variable names and commands. There is no need for data type declarations in this, but unfortunately, sometimes the exam board asks for it, so you will need to use comments to declare data types, and we'll look at that in a moment. There is no repeat until loop at all, which is brilliant because there's one less thing to worry about. There is no case of otherwise statements. That's brilliant as well. That means you only need to focus on if, elif, else statements, but you've got to be very careful because indentation is very important in Python, and Python is unforgiving if you misindent something in your code. But we're going to be looking at that and establishing good practices as we go along. So let's start by looking at the print function, which is the basic function to output something on screen. So this will output any text or any information that's often stored in a variable. The syntax is simply print, lowercase, brackets, and then if you want to output a string, then you will need to put that in quote marks. Remember to close the bracket as well. You can print any variable, in this case print number. Will print out whatever the number variable stores. You can print out an array or a value which is stored at a particular index in an array. So you can look at that array, square bracket, index, so make sure that you don't muddle up the brackets there. That's one common mistake students make all the time. And finally, you can also have a combination of strings and variables, which is denoted in the last line. Print, this is the answer, which is basically a string, comma, the answer variable. So you're combining both of them, you're joining things together. We're going to look at that in a moment as well. But before that, let's deal with variables. Python has no command for declaring a variable, and that can be slightly confusing if you come from programming languages where you have to first declare a variable and then assign a value to it. Python is pretty clever, it's more modern. The moment you assign a value to any name, it automatically creates a memory location and it points to that memory location and it knows it's an integer type or a string type or a float type. To me, that's amazing. I don't need to worry about declaring arrays. I don't need to worry about lists. I don't need to worry about declaring variables. I can just simply use them. However, the exam board still deals with some archaic programming languages like Java, like Visual Basic, and you're supposed to declare variables in exam questions. Now to deal with that, what they do is they simply say that for Python, you can declare a variable using pseudocode in a comment statement. Now on screen, you can see an example of how we could use a comment statement to declare a variable. It's that simple, just use the hash key and then declare the variable name as a data type. Now, variable names need to be defined in a sensible and meaningful way. We can't just randomly choose any letters and make that into a variable because it doesn't mean anything to someone reading the code. So variable name has a set of rules. It must start with a letter or the underscore character. A variable name cannot start with a number. A variable name can only contain alphanumeric characters and underscores. So those are A to Z, 0 to 9, and the underscore character. Variable names are case sensitive. So age, lowercase, sentence case age, and capital age are three different variables according to Python. So be careful on how you spell them. Now let's look at some valid and invalid examples of these. Sum is a valid example, all lowercase. Sum with a capital S is valid. Underscore sum1 is valid according to the rules defined earlier. Invalid examples of variable names would be one sum, number cannot begin a variable name. Sum minus 1 is another example because minus is an operator and that can't be used in a variable name. Sum space 1 is also invalid because space is an invalid character and is not part of the alphanumeric character set A to Z or 0 to 9 or the underscore character. So be careful on how you spell your variable names. Now each variable generally has a data type. Now Python doesn't really care about data types, but again for exam boards we will need to be very careful in how we specify data types. However, where Python does care about data types is that if you've already defined an existing variable as a particular data type, and you can't just go around changing it because that will throw up an error. So the common data types are string, str, integer, int for numbers, real, or as Python calls it, float for real numbers, that means decimal numbers, boolean, which is true or false, and date. Now you can convert a data type from one to the other, or you can find out what the data type of a particular variable is if you don't know that. So here you can see number 1 is assigned the value 5.456, and the very eagle-eyed will probably automatically know that's a float or real. But if you don't know what that is, you can just simply type the statement print brackets type bracket number 1 and then close the brackets. Type is a function that is built into Python and returns the data type. Now if you remember your functions and procedures, functions always return something, so therefore this is a function. So number integer in this case, we can also specify that convert that number 1 into an integer format. So what I'm going to do is take the original number 1, which is 5.456, and then I can say int number 1, which converts it to 5. And then I can print the type of number integer, which would now give me an int, whereas the first one would give me float. Now you can test these commands out by typing them out in your Python IDE. I would recommend REPL.it, which is an online IDE. You can use that, or you can use PyCharm or whatever IDE that your center is going to use for you to do the exam, so you get familiar with utilizing that. Remember, online IDEs are not allowed in an exam, so your exam center probably is going to be selecting an IDE which is local, kind of like PyCharm, or you might use idle. So please do have a look at that. Maybe have a discussion with your center to find out what IDE that they're going to use, and then start practicing these commands using that particular IDE so you get familiar. And if you don't know what an IDE, it's an integrated development environment which is used by programmers to code. Now be careful with brackets and spelling, please, because these are the two common mistakes that most students make while programming. It leads to a lot of errors which can easily be fixed. So please make sure that you are constantly checking that your variable names are consistent and your brackets are closed. Now after variables, we're going to be looking at mathematical and logical operators. Now these are pretty straightforward and you've encountered them before, I hope. Addition is a plus, subtraction is a minus, division is a slash, multiplication is a star. There are two additional ones which are mod and div. Now if you have not done maths properly before, you won't know what these are. Mod basically is the remainder from a division, and we use the percentage sign for that. Div is 2 slashes, and that gives the quotient, the number that you divide by. We'll look at that in a moment as well in a bit more detail. Less than and greater than signs are pretty straightforward. Not equal to is the exclamation mark and the equal to sign. It's not the left and the right signs which used to be common in pseudocode. It is the exclamation mark equal to signs together. Less than equal to is pretty straightforward. Greater than or equal to is again pretty straightforward. Remember, the greater than and the less than signs come first, then the equal signs come for these ones. And finally, Boolean operators are basically and, or, not. And we'll look at those operators in a bit more depth. Now, less than, greater than, not equal to, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to are logical operators. And these come in handy when we do if statement. Now let's look at div and mod in a bit more depth. If you were dividing 100 by 3, you will know that 3 goes 33 times into 100, which kind of gives you 99. And then you are left with 1 as a remainder. The basic concept is long division. Now sometimes we just want to get the remainder and we don't want anything else. In that case, we have to use mod, which gives you the 1. Div is when you want the quotient, the number that goes into that 100. 3 times 33 is equal to 100, so 33 is your quotient or your div. The syntax for div and mod are 2 slashes for div, because 1 slash is a divide, 2 slashes give you the div, and percentage symbol is used for mod. Now hopefully that gives you a bit of basic understanding of simple Python syntax. Let's test this out through a practice question. So the first practice question is, you're going to assign 50 to a variable called num1. You're going to multiply that number with 40.49 and store the solution in a variable which is called answer. You're going to print the integer part of this answer with a relevant message. For example, the answer is, declare all the variables that you've used using comment statements. Pause the video and in your IDE, your Python development environment, write the code for this. And when you're ready, continue so you can check out the solution or one possible way to solve this. Okay, hopefully you've solved that problem and you've got this type of code. Remember, there could be multiple ways you're doing this, but this is the most common answer to that question. You're declaring num1 as integer, you're declaring answer as real, and then num1 is assigned the value 50, answer is assigned the value of 50 times 40.49, that's why it's real. You're then going to use the print statement, and you're going to use a string which says the answer is, or whatever sensible message you've written there, comma, integer of answer, because we just want the integer part, we don't want the decimal part of that particular answer. And you should have something like, the answer is 2024, which is probably the year you will give your exam for this particular syllabus. Let's continue with string concatenation. Now, concatenation is a very difficult word to say, so I normally tell my students to divide it into 4 parts: con, cat, e, nation, and then join them together, which is what concatenation is all about, joining things together. Now, strings are basically any text in speech marks, and sometimes we want to join 2 strings or strings and numbers or other things together, and for that we use concatenation. There are multiple ways to do that. You can do it manually by using something like print brackets the string Ashley plus the string Patil. You can do that through the use of a variable. In this case, combined is equal to Ashley plus Patil, and then I can print the combined out. Now, this combined can be made out of other strings, like you could have a first name string and a surname string, and you can join them together as well. This leads us to practice question 2. Assign your first name to a variable, which is called string1, and your second name to a variable, which is called string2. Combine both of the strings with a space between them and store it in a variable called combined_string, and then you need to output this variable. Pause the video and program this and then check the answer. Okay, here's one possible solution to the problem. You're going to declare the string1, string2, and combined_string as strings in a comment statement. String 1 is going to be your first name, string 2 is going to be your second name, combined underscore string is going to be a concatenated version of the two strings plus a space, and then you're going to use the print statement to output the combined underscore string variable. You should have something like your first name space your second name printed out on screen. Now, if you made some mistakes and your program doesn't work, check for syntax errors. It's probably because you spelled a variable name incorrectly or you missed a bracket or so. Now, one thing I want to point out is that even though I did not specify in the question for you to declare variables in a comment statement, get into a habit of declaring them anyway, because you never know, they might award 1 mark for this in an exam question, and chances are it's only going to be 1 or 2 marks in the entire exam paper. But if you get into a habit of declaring your variables in comment statements for every program that you write, it's going to make your life so much easier, and you might get that hidden mark, which could make the difference between a grade boundary. Now let's look at getting data into a program from a user. In this case, we're going to use an input statement. So in a number variable, we're going to use the input statement, and then whatever value that the user types in is going to be assigned to this number variable. Now in Python, the input function always returns a string value. So if it's a number, that you're supposed to change it into an integer or float using int number or float number. Alternatively, you could also change the input at the source, and as number equals int of whatever the user inputs. Now the brackets and the prompt inside the bracket is used for your user interface to make it easier for the user to know what they're entering. You don't really need to use it, but it makes more sense. Otherwise, they just see an empty blinking cursor there and they don't know what they need to type in. Now let's test this out by doing practice question 3. Ask 2 real numbers from the user, add both of these numbers, and print the answer with the relevant message. Pause the video and then complete this code, and then continue to check the answer, or one possible answer. Now on screen, you'll probably see a piece of code that solves that. I haven't put the declaration statements here because they would end up taking more of the screen space. However, you should have comment statements as well, defining number 1 and number 2, which store a float input from the user. Answer will add number 1 and number 2. That one should also be float, and then you simply print with an appropriate prompt the answer. So if you typed in 30.5 and 20.4 as your input numbers, you should get an answer which says 50.9. You can test your program using that if you wish. If your program wasn't working or you've had some difficulty, study this particular code and then continue on to the next part. Now we're going to move on to selection statements. And what are selection statements? Selection statements test conditions, and based on a particular condition, they execute a different set of instructions. They use logical conditions most of the time, using logical operators like equals, not equals, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. We looked at those logical operators earlier. The only one I want to mention here before we continue is the equals. In Python, we use 2 equals signs to denote an equal statement because we use 1 equals as an assignment operator in Python. So for example, number equals 50 is assignment. If number equals 50 will not work. You will need to use if number equals 50 because Python specifies 2 equal signs in a selection statement as saying the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side. So be very careful with this. Let's look at the syntax in a bit more detail. If a condition, which could be numbers, 2 equal signs 50, then you print something out. Else, we can have another condition. If number equals 70, then we print something else out. Else, print something else out. So the if condition statement checks the original condition. The elif condition is used to check multiple conditions. Maybe you want to check 4 or 5 different things out. Remember, there is no case of in Python, so we only use if. And the else one simply says that if all the other conditions were checked and they weren't met, then run this part of the code. Now note that Python relies on indentation, which is white space at the beginning of a line to define the scope of the code. So the print statement is part of the original condition, and it will only run if the original condition was met. Now, in other languages, you would probably be using curly brackets or something like that to denote this, but in Python, we use indentation. Let's practice a basic if statement using this particular question. So practice question 4. Ask the user to guess a number, and if that number is equal to 20, then print your guess is correct. So it's a simple guessing game. Pause the video, write your code, and then continue to check. Okay, you should have something simple as this. Remember, once again, the comment statements aren't written here. You need to write them down to declare the guess variable. So guess is equal to an integer. If guess 2 equals sign is equal to 20, then you print that the guess is correct. So when the user types in 30, nothing will be output. If the user types in 20, you output your guess is correct. That's all the original question wanted you to do. Now, if you decided to use else and elif in there, then you probably jumped the gun because we're going to look at that in practice question 5. Else is the keyword that is executed if the first condition is false. And elif is Python's way of saying that if the previous condition was not true, try this one. So now modify that original program from practice question 4 to output your guess was higher if the guess is higher than 20. And if the guess was lower than 20, then output your guess was lower. You have to use all three parts, if, elif, and else in your code. Pause the video, have a go, and then press continue. Okay, again, haven't defined the comment statement to declare guess. Declare guess colon integer would probably be something that starts this code up. Then guess is equal to int input guess the number. In this case, we're going to check if guess is equal to 20. If it is, we're going to print your guess is correct. Elif guess greater than 20, guess was higher. If it's not correct, if it's not higher, then we simply output your guess was lower. And you can probably have a different set of combinations of these. You might have checked greater than first or less than first, and then output your guess is correct. Whichever method you used, you should have this type of structure. Okay, let's look at Boolean operators and how these can be used with selection statements. And basically means both the conditions should be true, or means any one condition should be true, not means the opposite of what is true. So an example could be that if guess is less than 20 or guess is greater than 20, then you output your guess is incorrect, else your guess is correct. So we're using a Boolean operator to say that if this condition is met or this condition is met, then you output this, else you output the correct. Because if it's not less than 20 or greater than 20, then it's the correct answer. Now with practice question 6, you're going to practice this and you're going to use Boolean operators to solve it with a selection statement. So ask the user for 3 real numbers and then print the largest number out. So the user is going to type in 3 numbers, so you could probably take 3 variables and then you can compare them to work out which is the largest. Pause the video, have a go, and then press play when you're ready to check one possible solution. Okay, so you should have something similar to this. Once again, there are no declaration statements because you can see the code is becoming a bit big now. So A, we're going to get a float input from the user. B is the second float input. We could call it number 1, number 2, number 3, which would probably be more sensible. And then we simply compare it. If A greater than B and A greater than C, then quite clearly A is the largest number. We output that. Well, if we check if B is greater than A and B is greater than C, then quite clearly B is the largest number. Else, that means the only option left, C is the largest number. Do we need to have another elif statement saying C greater than A and C greater than B? Not really, because if the first 2 statements aren't true, then quite clearly the final one is going to be the correct output. So sometimes when you could write it down, it's up to you. But what are you going to write in the else part? Okay, we could also do this using a nested if statement. Now, a nested if statement is basically an if within an if. So when you're not using Boolean operators, you can use 2 if statements to get the same answer. So here we're going to check if A is greater than B first, and then in that we're going to check if A is also greater than C, and then we're going to print out A is the largest. Then we're going to do another nested if statement where we're going to say if B was greater than A, then inside that, if B is greater than C, and then if that's true, then we print B is the largest. Else, we simply say C is the largest. Now, nested if statements are lengthier, they're more inefficient, and if you can use Boolean operators, chances are you can make your code quite concise and efficient, but they can be very confusing to read. If you have multiple Boolean operators, they can become quite complex to solve. So the choice is up to you: clarity in your code versus conciseness and complexity. Now we're going to put everything together in practice question 7. You're going to ask the user to enter an email address and a password, and if these are correct, then you're going to print login successful, and if one of them is wrong, then you're going to print incorrect login information. Now the correct email is if@gmail.com, and the correct password is else99. Pause the video and then have a go, and when you're ready, continue to check one possible solution. Okay, on screen you can see the solution. We could declare these variables: email as a string, password as a string, and then we take the input and store it in email. We take the input from the user and store it in password, and then we use if email is equal to the correct one and password is the correct one, then login successful, else incorrect. Again, quite effective with Boolean operators. You could use a nested if here as well. If email is equal to if@gmail.com, and then a nested if statement saying if password is equal to else99, then print login successful, else print incorrect login information. That's also possible. With that, we draw this lesson to a close. Hopefully, you now understand basic Python syntax. You've had some practice in coding. You should be able to declare variables in Python using comments. You should understand the use of div and mod. That is quite useful. They normally ask for div and mod in one question. I've seen that in past papers. So be careful with utilizing that and understanding how it works. Use of the print and input commands, that's pretty straightforward. Understand the use of concatenation and joining things together. Use the if, elif, else selection statements, and understand the use of nested if statements and how Boolean and logical operators work in relation to statements as well. Now, these Boolean and logical operators are quite useful because they also come in handy when we do loops. So we're going to be looking at that in one of the future lessons as well. That's all for today. If you do have any questions, please do post them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to Python Basics 2. In this particular lesson, we're going to be focusing on loops and arrays, and we're also going to be looking at some basic functions that you do from day to day, like sum, count, min, max, and so forth. This lesson is part of the 9-lesson series, which focuses on all the skills you need to code in Python for paper 4 of the A-level exam for Cambridge. The first 5 lessons are also useful for IGCSE students as well, and if you want to practice coding at AS level, these will be suitable for you. Lessons 6 onwards are more relevant to A-level students because they deal with advanced concepts. So what are loops? Well, loops are programming constructs that repeat code based on a condition. And there are normally 3 types of loops: precondition, where the condition is checked before you run the rest of the code; postcondition, where you run the code at least once and then check the condition to see if you want to continue repetition; and count control loops, which run that code for a set number of times. In Python, there are only 2 types of loops: precondition and count controlled, because there is no repeat until loop in Python. So the only 2 loops we need to focus on in Python are the while and the for loops. Now let's start with the count control loop, or the for loop. Now this is a very common loop. Chances are that if you've done programming before, you're familiar with this, but if you're not, let's take it from the start. A for loop is a count control loop, which means it will automatically increment a variable and will loop for a fixed number of times. So if you want to loop something 10 times, we just know that it will always need to run 10 times. We don't need to check a particular condition, even though the 10 in that syntax is your condition. So the syntax is basically for, index in range, 10 in brackets. So whatever you put in the brackets is your count. and then you can do whatever you want. In this case, we're just going to print out the index. Now the index is a variable, and you will need to declare that as well in comments. Remember that. In this particular case, this loop will run 10 times and it will print the index. So it'll start with 0 and it'll iterate 10 times. Now note once again, indentation is very important. The instructions which are to be executed inside the loop should be indented. So that's the way Python knows that this is the code that needs to be repeated 10 times. So let's start with practice question 1. In your IDE, input 10 names from the user and print good morning with each name. And for a harder challenge, you could use a list or an array to store the values and then output them. You might not be able to do the second part if you're not familiar with arrays yet. Don't worry, you could come back to this later. But the first one should be pretty straightforward. Pause the video, have a go, and if you're not sure, you can continue and look at the solution. You should have something like this. For x in range 10, name is equal to input. We're going to give it a prompt, enter name. The user will enter this name, and then we're going to simply print a concatenated string, which is good morning plus space plus the name. Now this is going to ask the name 10 times, and it's going to print good morning, that particular name. Now if you manage to get something like this going, fantastic. If you weren't, just have a look at the code, study it, code it, run it, and then practice it before continuing. Now we're going to look at some use cases of for loops or count control loops, and we're going to start with sum or totaling technique. In this particular case, we're going to define a variable at the beginning, sum, which we're going to set to 0 because there is no addition yet. We're going to then run a loop for x in range 10. You can call it index, that's probably a better choice. And then we're simply going to say number is going to be a float input, and the user will enter this number. And then sum is going to be sum, which in this case is 0, plus whatever number the user inputs. And this is going to run 10 times. So it's going to take 10 inputs and continue adding to that total. And finally, we will print the sum out, which if you can see, based on the indentation, is outside the loop. So the only two lines of code which are part of the loop are the number input and the addition. Everything else is outside the loop. Time for you to do some practice now. Ask 5 numbers from the user and print the sum of those numbers. Pause the video, write this code in your IDE, test it, and then continue. Hopefully you've got something like this. You've set the sum equals to 0 for x in range 5, because in this particular case we want to run it 5 times. We get the input, we do the addition, and then we print the sum out. Remember, we're using count control loops. You could do this using a while loop as well, but we're not going to do that because we're focusing on learning the for loop. Okay, let's look at working out the max or the maximum number based on whatever inputs or whatever data you have. So in this case, we're going to create a variable called large, and we're going to set large as 0 because 0 is the largest number. Now, if you're dealing with negative numbers, you might want to set this to a very crazy negative number like minus 9999999 or something like that. We're then going to run a for loop. In this case, it's going to run 10 times. We're then going to get a float input again, and we're going to then compare using a selection. If the number that the users entered is greater than large, then large becomes that number. So if the user in this case enters 5, large becomes 5. And then if in the second time they enter 10, large becomes 10. And it's going to continue doing that for 10 cycles or 10 loops. And then at the end, it's going to print the largest number out because we print large at the end. Time for you to do some practice now. So practice question 3 is all about inputting 5 numbers and printing the largest number. So write this code in your IDE and then continue when you're ready to check your answer. You should have started off with a large or equivalent variable set to 0 or a negative number if you so wish. For index or x in range 5, number is going to be input by the user, which is a float input. If number is greater than large, then large becomes that number, print large. So similar type of code as previous. The only bit you should have changed was that x in range to 5 or index in range to 5. Make sure you're also continuing on with declarations. So you should have declared large and x and number inside a comment statement as the relevant data types. Now let's look at count. We're going to start similarly. We're going to set the count to 0. Sometimes we need to count some numbers or how many times something occurs or how many inputs the user has done or all sorts of crazy things. So in this case, we're going to start with setting up a count to 0 because at the beginning there is no count. We're then going to do a for loop once again for index or x in the range 5. In this case, the loop will run 5 times. We're going to just simply say count is equal to count plus 1. We can then print the count out. This just does a counter. Now we don't necessarily need to do that because technically the x or the index is also being incremented by the for loop. So we could just simply say count is equal to x, and that would work as well. But you might need it for various different reasons. So I'm going to leave this code as is. There are multiple ways to do count. So for practice question 4, input 5 numbers from the user and print how many of those are positive numbers and how many of those are negative numbers. Now here you would need to get some additional variables, one to store the positive count, one to store the negative count. So you might want to play around with that. There will be a selection statement in there as well. So pause the video, have a go at this code, and then when you're ready, continue to check your answer. You should have a positive or negative count at the beginning. You should have a for index or x in range of 5 because we wanted 5 numbers in. Number is going to be exactly the same thing, a float input, and then you're going to compare using a selection statement. If number is greater than 0, then the positive becomes positive plus 1. If it is less than 0, then negative is equal to negative plus 1. You might want to put in less than equal to or greater than equal to, depending on whether you count 0 as a positive or a negative number. I'll leave that up to you, or you could simply have else where you ignore 0. That's up to you as well, that's possible. Finally, outside the loop, you're going to print there are whatever positive numbers and there are whatever negative numbers, and it will print that count out. This is a very good use of both counting and selection. So here we're using the techniques of count control loops, counting, selection, and concatenation. We're now going to look at min. In this case, we're just going to work out the smallest number. So we have to define a number which is very large at the beginning. So small is going to be, in our case, 9999, or you could have a billion or some crazy number or something like that. We're then going to run a loop again. Loop is going to be run 10 times for x in range 10 or index in range 10, up to you. Number is going to be input. If number is now less than small, small becomes that number, and this continues 10 times, and finally we output the small outside the loop. Once it's finished the 10 inputs, we can then output whatever the small number is. Now if you put the print statement inside the loop, it's going to print the small every single time. So you're going to end up with 10 smalls, right? We only want it once, so it has to be outside the loop. Time for you to practice. Input 5 numbers and print the smallest. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue to check your answer. Okay, you should have something similar to the code previously. A very large number as small for x in the range 5 or index in the range 5, which is probably better. Number is equal to float input. If number less than small, small equals number, print small, which is outside the loop. Your code should work. Test it out, and if it doesn't work, check your syntax, check your brackets, check your indentation. And that's all that I'm going to focus on for now with count control loops, and we're going to move on to conditional loops, which are normally while, do, and while, or repeat until in pseudocode. However, since we don't have a repeat until loop, we're only going to focus on the while loop in Python. Now these conditional loops run when the condition is true. If the condition is false, then you exit the loop. The syntax basically for a while loop is while whatever condition you're checking, colon, is met, it's true, you run the code. In this case, if a condition is true, it's going to print out hello. Be careful about indentation once again, and the case of the while, it's lowercase and the colon at the end. Just like a selection statement, you've got to make sure the colon is present. Let's look at how this code looks in Python. So this code is going to print hello 10 times using a while loop. So we're going to set x equal to 0, and we're going to simply say while x is less than 10, print hello, and then we're going to increment x. Now we could do that with a count control loop as well, but we're going to look at condition checks here. So the same piece of code is possible using a count control loop or a while loop, but depending on what you're doing with it, one is more efficient than the other, and that's the choice in programming. Are you going to use a count control loop for this, or are you going to use a while loop for this? So type this code up and test it out, and if it works, continue on, because we're going to do a practice next. So practice question 6 is all about inputting 5 numbers and printing the sum of those numbers using a while loop. So pause the video and have a go in your IDE, and when you're ready, continue to check your answer. Okay, one possible solution is this. You set a variable to 0, x, you set sum to 0 because we're totaling in this one as well. And while x is less than 5, number is going to be float input, and then we're going to just simply add that number to the sum and then also increment x manually. Now this could also be done using a count control loop, but we're testing conditional loops. I just wanted to show you both types of loop which can do similar things. So here we're doing totaling using a conditional loop in a way. Now remember, this is one possible solution and yours might look different than mine. However, if we get to the same answer, that's all good. And with that, I'm going to stop with loops. We're going to be using loops throughout our series of lessons on Python. We're going to now focus on arrays, and arrays are going to be using loops anyway. So let's start by understanding what an array is. Arrays store multiple values of the same data type. Now in Python, we use a list as an array under a single identifier. For example, names is going to store a list of names, and that's normally denoted through the use of square brackets. Now, not round brackets, and that's a very common mistake that students make while dealing with arrays. They use round brackets, which throws up an error. Arrays or lists always use square brackets. If you look at the syntax, names is equal to a set of names. The data that is stored in this array is at an index location, and we start with index 0 in Python. So Tat is at index position 0, Rosie is at index position 1, and Yusuf is in index position 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's a total of 6 values. So just be very careful with the maths here. Because we're starting with 0, when we're running a loop, we've got to be careful about the end condition. So let's start by looking at how an array works and how we can print values out of an array. So we're going to define an array by simply saying names equal to square brackets and a set of values. That's fine. We need to declare the array in a comment statement, just like a variable. So you'll normally say a comment is going to be names colon array of strings, something like that. That works. So if you want to print a single item from an array, we just need to know the index location. So we'll simply say print brackets names square brackets 1, which outputs Rosie. If I want to print all the items, I have to run a loop, because you can see there are a lot of values in there. I don't want to write print names 0, print names 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's easier to do it in a loop. So for index in range, the length of names, so that means however long the names array is, run the loop that many times. So here I'm using the length function, which is built into Python. So all you need to do to work out the length of an array is use the function called len, L-E-N, bracket names, and that will automatically work out how long an array is and run the loop that many times. Now, I don't need to do that. I could just simply type in 6 because the loop should run 6 times. That's fine as well, but I'm just trying to be a bit more smarter, because if I add more names in the future, the code is still going to work. So for index in range length of names, colon, print names, square bracket index. So every time the index begins with 0, and then it's going to keep incrementing it, and it's going to keep outputting all the names that are in the array. You can try this code in your IDE and see if it works, or you can have a go at practice question 7. Asks you to create an array with the following names and then work out the index position of bow and output it. So that's going to now require you to think about how the for loop works and how do you work out the index location. So you will need to use a selection and a print statement output at the end outside the loop. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue to check the code. Hopefully you've got something like this. You've got an array with a list of names using square brackets. You've got for index in range length of names. And then you've got a bit of comparison going on, that if names square bracket index 2 equal signs bow colon, print the value of that particular index. Otherwise you just carry on checking. Okay, so it will only print out the value if the index matches bow. Now you could also store it in a variable and then print it outside the loop. That's possible as well. There are multiple ways to solve this, but the general principle would be something like this. Now what if I wanted to add an item to a list or an array? Once again, I can simply use the built-in functions. In this case, the names are already defined. I'm going to simply append the names list or the names array by simply saying names.append, and I'm going to put whatever value I want to add to that inside the brackets. It's simply going to add heart to the end of the names list, and then it's going to print that names list out, which you should see Tat, Rosie, Radia, Rano, Bao, Yusuf, and Heart printed out. Again, you can test this code in Python, or you can try practice question 8, where you have to create an array with 5 names, input a name from the user. If that name is in the array, then you need to print out name exists. And if it is not in the array, then you need to add it into the array and output all the names at the end. Okay, so this one is going to test your ability to use selections and your ability to use append. Pause the video, have a go at coding it, and then continue to check the solution. Okay, now you should already have that names array coded up from a previous question. We're just going to build on that. So in this particular case, we're going to take a user input. We're going to set a counter or x is equal to 0. We're going to have a Boolean flag as well in this particular case. Now there are multiple ways to do this. This is just my implementation. So if your code is working using a while loop, brilliant. And if it isn't working, then you might want to study this code to understand it. So how does it work? Well, while x is less than the length of names, so we start with 0, and we're now using a while loop, remember, and the flag is equal to false, for example, we haven't found the item yet, carry on running this code. So if new name, which the user has entered, is equal to names brackets x, which is now the index, you print it's already there. So if the name matches at any index location, then we already know it exists. Else, you append it, set the flag to true because we've just added that in, and outside of the selection statement, you increment x because we have to increment x every single time we do the check. Outside the while loop, we're going to then print the names out because at the end of the whole cycle, we want to print out whatever is in the array. Hopefully you've got something like this. Make sure that your indentation is right. Test the code, run it yourself, and see if it works. In practice question 9, we are going to have an array with a set of numbers. What I want you to do is to reverse the order of the array and output the contents of the array. So you should have something like 86, 75, 56, 24, 32, and 10 output at the end of it. Pause the video, have a go, and then check your solution. Okay, you should have something like this going on. There are lots of ways of doing this. You could even use a built-in routine, which is called sort, and you can do inverse sorts and all sorts of stuff. Now, if you use some of those advanced techniques because you've searched it online, fantastic. But a basic way of solving this would be to have the original array and then have another array, which is the reverse order array. In this case, I've called it new. There is something called an opposite index, which starts with 5 because we are now going to decrement it. Now, I don't need to store the items in an array. I could have just output it. That's fine as well. However, in this particular case, I'm simply going to create a for loop and I'm going to run it 6 times. I could also run it for the length of numbers, which would probably be much better, but I'm keeping it as is. Now, in the new array at the index location, because index begins with 0, I'm going to store the numbers at the opposite index, which is 5. So what happens is, in index location 5, the number 86 is present. That is now stored at index location 0 in the new array. And then I'm going to decrement the opposite index by 1. And then we're going to repeat the same step with 4, which is going to go to index position 1, and then 3 at index position 2, and so on. At the end, outside the loop, I'm going to print the new array out. Now, if you were confused and you couldn't solve this, try to type this code in and understand it before continuing. Of course, there's lots of different types of solutions. You might have done this with a while loop as well. That's fine as well. Remember, that's the beauty of programming. There are multiple ways to end up at the same answer. Now let's continue with practicing. Practice question number 10. Here you need to ask numbers from the user and find the average of those numbers. When the user types in a 0, then you print out the average. So you continue the input until a 0 is entered by the user, and then you print out that average. Pause the video, code this, and then continue to check a possible solution. Here's one possible solution. Pause the video and study it. Pretty straightforward. You have a sum, you have a count, or both of those are set to 0. We have a flag which is set to true. We always want to run this loop until the flag is set to false. So I'm using a flag to dictate how this while loop runs. Number is input, which is a float input by the user. If the number is equal to 0, then the flag is set to false. That means we are now going to exit the while loop. Else, we're going to simply increment the count and we're going to keep adding the sum with the number. So you're continuing to increment the total, and it's going to keep on doing this. It's going to loop again. It's going to check a new number. It's going to update the count. It's going to update the sum, ask a new input, repeat the process until the user enters 0. In that case, the if selection is triggered, the first part, and then we exit the while loop. And outside the loop, I'm going to simply work out the average and print it out. So this is one possible solution. Of course, there's multiple ways to do this. You might have done it in a different way, provided you get to the same answer and you enter a few numbers and manually check whether the average is coming out and it exits at 0, you're okay with it. In the exam, you're not just going to be dealing with 1D array. We just dealt with one-dimensional arrays where everything was a single list. We'll also need to learn how to manipulate 2D arrays. Now, a 2D array is a data structure that stores elements in a grid or matrix of rows and columns. So a 2D array to me is basically a table. That's how I visualize it. It consists of multiple rows and columns where each element is uniquely identified by its row and column value. For example, if you look at a table, at the top you can have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 as the index location, and on the row side going downwards you can also have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 as index location. So one particular element in that table will have coordinates 0, 0 or 0, 1 or 0, 2 or 1, 1 or 1, 2 or something like that. Now 2D arrays are commonly used in programming to represent images, screens, game boards and all sorts of things. So they're very useful for you to learn and manipulate. So how do you create a 2D array? Well, we're going to learn this using multiple ways and you can pick whichever is the easiest one for you. So we're going to create an array with 3 columns and 5 rows. So how do we do that? Well, first way is to simply give the name of the array, and instead of having one bracket, we're going to have 2 square brackets because you want to have 3 columns repeated 5 times. What we're going to do here is the middle bracket, the middle square bracket is going to have your 3 columns, and the outside square bracket is going to be multiplying that by 5. So we're simply going to say these 3 columns are going to be repeated 5 times. Very easy to do. Now you could do this using loops, which is again a bit more complex, requires more lines of code. Rows 5, columns 3, array, for x in range columns, for x in range rows. That would work as well. And we're going to put 0 in each column. Remember, that's possible. Or I could put a space in each column. That's fine as well. 0 denotes what value I want. Remember, you've got to initialize that with a value as well. So you can't just have an empty space. Okay? You could either have a space character or 0. So in the first way, the array times 5 one, we have a space being input 3 times 5, 15 times, and in this one we're just going to have the value 0 being input. Now that's fine, this is okay, you can code this and work it out as well. Or you can use a mixture of numbers and loops. So if you look at the next one, we've got the space value times 3 for I in range 5. That's another way of creating a 2D array. Now most students prefer the very first one. That's the most simplest way to do it. And I would probably say that's the one you should learn as well. However, if you understand how the other two work, you can just make your code that much more efficient. And you never know what kind of pseudocode you're given to code in an exam. So if they give you the for loop based one, you should be able to code that as well. Pretty straightforward, very easy to do. But if you want to code it yourself, the best way to do it is the first one, in my opinion. That's the one that most of my students use. Okay, so how do we access items in a 2D array? Well, the 1D array uses array square bracket index. A 2D array has 2 index positions, so both are used. So array, square bracket row index, and column index. So how does it work in Python? Well, we're going to use, in this case, the concept of nested loops. Remember nested if statements from last lesson? We can do the same thing with loops. So the outer loop will be the rows and the inner loop will be the columns. So in this case, for rows in range 5, because there were 5 rows, for columns in range 3, because there were 3 columns, print out array square bracket row comma column. That should allow you to print out each item in the array. You can try coding this to get to grips with the 2D array and then try the practice question. So practice question 11, you're asked to create a 2D array called array2D. It should have the following values. Print present if Faisal is in the array. Now you can automatically see Faisal is in the array. What I want you to do is work out a way of the computer telling you that Faisal is present in the array. So there will be a selection in there somewhere as well, especially in your nested for loop. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue. Okay, you should have something like this. A 2D array called array 2D for rows in range 2, because there are 2 rows, as you can see, and 3 columns in each row. So for rows in range 2, for column in range 3, if array 2D rows and column equals Faisal, then we print out present. Otherwise, we don't care. Something along the lines of this should be happening in your code. So hopefully you've got something like this going on, and you might have tried different ways of coding this. That's fine. If you couldn't understand how this works, pause the video, code this, test it out, and then understand it. And that brings us to the end of this particular lesson. Hopefully you understood the use of sum, min, max, count through the use of for loops or count control loops. You also understood how precondition loops like while work, and you've got some coding and you're familiar with the syntax. You understand the use of 1D arrays and 2D arrays, and you can code and access data from both 1D and 2D arrays. So you can code empty arrays, or you can type exact values in those arrays and then print values out from those arrays. You should also be able to add to an array using the append function. And if you're doing that with a 2D array, I'm going to leave it up to you. All you need to do is work out what index locations, row and column indexes that you want a value to be inserted, and you can inject a value there. That's possible as well. You can try that out for yourself. That's all for this particular lesson. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Welcome to Python Basics Lesson 3. In this session, we're going to be looking at functions and procedures and a bit of string manipulation. This lesson is in a series of 9 lessons focusing on paper 4 of the A-level syllabus from Cambridge. If you're also studying IGCSE computer science, the first 5 lessons will be relevant to you. Otherwise, if you're interested in programming, especially Python programming, you'll learn a lot of skills. The overall structure that we're following is on screen. We've covered this before, so I'm not going to go through this. Let's start by looking at what functions and procedures actually are and how Python deals with them. Now, in the previous lessons, you were writing a bit of code and it was sequential. So you start with the first line, then you write another line, you might have a loop, you might have a selection, but everything was in one program. The beauty of programming is that we can take a modular approach. So code that can often be repeated or asked for a number of times, we can put them in functions or procedures, and that makes code reusable and allows us to test pieces of code and create program libraries and all sorts of things which make programming efficient and allow other programmers to access the modules that have been created by perhaps people before us, instead of repeating the same code and writing the same thing again and again and again. So functions and basically procedures are just a block of code which only runs when it's called. If you don't call it, it will just stay there, it won't do anything. Now you can pass data to these functions which are known as parameters, and generally procedures and functions are the same thing in Python from the implementation point of view. The only difference between functions and procedures is that functions will return a value back or multiple values back to the main program. Procedures will just do something and that's the end of it. They will not return anything back to the main program. Another difference is that procedures are just called, whereas because the function is returning a value back to the main program, it has to be assigned to a variable. Both of these are implemented the same way using a definition statement. In this case, I'm defining the name function or procedure. It's a procedure because it's not returning anything back to the main program, and this name procedure will just print hello on the screen. Now, how do I call this procedure? If I want to use this procedure in the main program, I will have to type in name and 2 round brackets. Now, you have been using procedures and functions a lot. Remember, input brackets, print brackets, all of these are procedures and functions which have been already coded in Python's programming library, so you don't need to write it from scratch. Length of something, perhaps an array, function if it returns something back. Okay, let's practice this, writing procedures, and especially procedures that take in a parameter. So have a go at practice question 1, where you need to create a greeting function, and when you pass in a name, it outputs hello, whatever the name is. So for example, if I call greeting, round brackets, a string in there called parole, it should print out hello Parul. Just remember that in the definition of greeting, in the round brackets, you will need to put a name or a variable that will be used by that particular program. That's the only hint I'll give you. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue on to check a possible solution. Hopefully you got something like this: def greeting, brackets name, and print hello, the name. Now, when you want to call this in the main program, you'll just simply write greeting and parole or name or whatever else it is. You could modify the program by asking the user for an input. That input is stored in name, and then this procedure is called to say a greeting to them. If you couldn't work this out, then code this and test it out. Remember, you will need to call it, and if you're not sure about how to call a procedure, all you need to do is write the name of the procedure, brackets, and whatever parameter you're going to send to it. Okay, let's try another question. Practice question 2 states, create a function for average in which it takes the sum and count as parameters. So you're putting 2 values into it now, and then this will return a value back to the main program. Now we're using a function, so there has to be a keyword to return average. So the keyword return is of vital importance here, return and then average, which returns the value back to the main program. And in the main program, you will need to create a variable where you will assign this function and its relevant arguments. Now, what's the difference between arguments and parameters? When you're calling a function or procedure, you're passing arguments. They actually have data value. Whereas parameters are part of the function definition statement or a procedure definition statement, and they're just placeholders. They don't actually have a value until you pass a value into them. So pause the video, have a go at coding this, and then continue to check a possible solution. Hopefully you got something like this. You defined the average function. It takes 2 parameters in, sum and count. Average is then worked out, which is equal to sum divided by count, and then you return average back to the main program using the return keyword. And in the main program, you got a variable. In this case, we call it answer, which is equal to average, and then we're passing in 2 arguments to it, which are 520, and then you print the answer out. Something along the lines of this. Now, if you couldn't do this, pause the video, code this, and test it out, see if it works. Use a calculator to check your answer, and if you're okay with it, continue on. Let's do practice question 3. You now need to create a function to display the multiplication table of the number which is passed on as a parameter. Now the user can pass any number into this program, and this function should be able to create a table like this. So the output should be as follows. You can see the output on screen. So here you're taking an input and you're passing that input into a function, and that function will then create this table. Now, this really is actually a procedure because it's outputting things and it's not actually returning anything back to the main program. But because Python doesn't care about procedures, the terminology is functions for everything, so I'm going to be calling these functions for now. So please be aware that this technically is a procedure, but because the terminology in Python is all functions, we're just going to call these functions, just to ensure consistency with how everybody else speaks around the world. Okay, pause the video and have a go, and then continue to check the answer. Hopefully you got something like this. You created a function called table, you pass in an input, and then you use a loop to create the multiplication table, and then you print it out. If you couldn't do this, pause the video and have a go. Of course, it's missing a couple of lines. The input statement is missing, and then the function call is missing where you pass on that input to the function. However, I'll leave that up to you. You've got to practice this yourself. For practice question 4, create a function for finding the largest value in an array and then print the multiplication table of that number. The array you should be using is on screen. The largest value quite clearly is 96. Now here, I want you to reuse your multiplication table function from the last practice question. So technically, you should have 2 functions in this one. The first one will work out the largest value, which then passes it on to the second function, which you've already written. There is no point in writing that code again or creating a new function that does everything. We're dealing with the reusability of code here, okay? So 2 functions is what I'm looking for in this particular question. Pause the video, have a go, and then when you're ready, continue on to check a possible solution. Hopefully you've got a solution like this. You've got the array, you've got your table definition that's already been created. You created a new large definition which takes that particular array and then works out what the largest number is and then returns the large number back to the main program. So what's happening is you're going to create a variable called temp, and in there you're going to call the large function, and then you're going to use that for your table. If you couldn't do this, pause the video and then type the code in and then test it to see if it works for you before continuing. Now we're just going to touch base with the linear search function here. We're going to focus on this in a bit more detail in a future lesson as well. But what I want you to do is just have a look at how we define a linear search function. And this technique will be used when we study linear search in a bit more depth in a future lesson. You're going to pass an array as a parameter along with the string value, which you're supposed to find. So in this array, we want to find something, and then we're going to use a loop to compare the value to whatever we're trying to find and return that back. Now, why am I focusing on this right now? Because the next practice question is going to utilize kind of like a linear search, and I just wanted to front load you so you know how this function works. So study this function and then have a go at practice question 5, where you're creating an array with 5 names and you're going to get the user to input a name, and then using a function you're going to search that particular array to find the name and either output found at index position 4 or outputs name does not exist in the array. So pause the video and have a go and then continue on to check a possible solution. On screen you see a possible solution to this. You've got a names array with a few names. You take a variable input name and get the user to input another name that they're looking for. You create a function which is going to take the array and the input as parameters, and then you're going to search it using a loop and a selection, and if it's found or not found, depending on whichever way you've implemented it, it either outputs the position or says it does not exist in the array. And then you're going to call that particular function from the main program. Because we're not returning anything, technically it's a procedure, but we know that Python calls it a function. So search, names array, and input name are the 2 arguments that are passed to the function, and it should tell you whether the name exists or not. Now, if you couldn't do this, pause the video, code this, and test it out. You should start getting familiar with how functions work and how they're called. And if you're not, take your time with it. You do not need to rush through this because functions are very critical for paper 4. You will be asked to use these. You need to be comfortable in coding them. Now, this is something that I do in a new lesson to check understanding of the code, but I thought I'll just leave that in the video so people at home can also test their skills of finding bugs in a code out. And this also gives you a greater understanding of how the code works. There are 5 mistakes in this program. Can you find them all? If you found them, write them in the comments. If you couldn't find them, then compare the code to the previous code, and that should kind of give you a hint. Some are very obvious, others might require you to have an eagle eye. Pause the video, check that out, and continue. I'm not going to share the answers. I think they're pretty straightforward. We're now going to move on to string manipulation. Now, we already know at times we need to join strings, but there are times where we also might need to break or split things apart. So strings need to be manipulated. And we normally use a technique called slicing to slice a particular string into 2 or more parts. Now, Python is pretty clever here. It automatically creates a list of individual characters where each character can be referenced individually, just like you would reference an item in an array. So if you typed in a name and you say name square bracket 3, it will get you the 4th character of that name because obviously it starts with 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3 is actually the 4th character. On screen you see an example. I am going to assign random name to a variable called name, and then I'm going to say print name square bracket 0, and that's going to print the 1st character out, which is R. What if we wanted more characters? Well, because every string is actually stored kind of like an array, even if you're using a variable, you could use the same technique. So here what I'm doing is simply assigning random name to name, and then in the first name variable I'm simply going to say name start with 0 and bring 6 characters back. So the first 6 characters are going to be stored in first name, which is random, and we do the same thing for second name, and then we print both of those out. So it's very easy for us to split a string in Python compared to other programming languages. Okay, let's have a go at practice question 6. Use a variable to store a name without a space, for example, Pete Townsend, just like we did random name. Separate the first name and the last name using the fixed character method. Output these in the following statement. Your first name is Pete and your second name is Townsend. So this builds on what we just did, and if you understood that piece of code, you should be able to code this without any particular problem. For an additional challenge, you might want to create a function and pass things on to that, but I will just be coding it as a normal program. So pause the video and then continue to check a possible solution. So hopefully you've got something like this. You've got your own name in, then you've got two variables where you split that particular string into two parts, and then you've got an output statement which uses those variables. If you were coding a function, then you split the string and then you pass first name and second name as parameters in that function call, and then you use that to output the same statement. Now sometimes we need to work out the length of a string, and that's again pretty straightforward. Just like an array, we can use the built-in length function, or len, L-E-N, and all you need to do is have a string, most likely in a variable, and then to another variable, in this case temp, we can just simply use len, L-E-N. This is a built-in function, and then we pass the parameter name, and that's going to assign whatever the length of that string is, or that array is, into the temp variable, and then we can print this out. Please do remember that spaces are also counted, because space is an ASCII character, and to a computer that has value. So just be careful when you're dealing with strings with spaces. Okay, let's have a go at practice question 7. Take a name as an input. So a name could be entered by a user, in this case Aditi Patel. Separate the first name and the second name. Output the name like the following. First name is Aditi, second name is Patel. Now try to work out the separator between both parts of the name and use that to work out the starting and end lengths of your string. So this one is very useful because sometimes when you're dealing with file handling, there are things called comma separated values, and the separator will need to be used to split different parts of data in a text file. So this will be very useful when we deal with file handling later on in the series of lessons as well. In this particular case, when the user is typing a name, they're probably using a space character as a split between first name and a second name. So you need to target that. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue on. Now, if you can't do it, you might just want to have a look at the code and then code it yourself so you get used to coding and splitting strings. On screen, you can see a possible solution. We take the name as an input. We then say the first length begins at 0. The total length is the length of the entire name string. And then we're going to use a loop, which is then going to check for that space character. And then it's going to create a counter that keeps on adding 1 to the first length. So remember, it starts with 0. We already know that. So we're just going to see where the space character is, and then we're going to use first len to work out the split. Okay, so it's just a bit of logic, and once we work out, well, okay, the space character is at position 5 or 6 or whatever else, then we know that the first name starts at 0 and ends at that particular place. So we need to just get that many characters back, and then we can do the same thing for last name, because the last name begins after it, so it's first length plus 1, that's the starting point, till the end of the length of that particular name string. So once we work both of those out, we can then output it. If you couldn't do this, try to code this so you can understand this better. It's just a bit of manipulation and a bit of logic, and it'll make sense once you've coded it. Now, of course, these aren't the only functions available. There are tons of these. So on screen, you can see a lot of functions where you can work out a string and change it into lowercase. This is built into Python. Name.lower changes everything to lowercase. Name.upper changes everything to uppercase. Name.capitalize, especially American capitalize because Python was developed in America, is going to change it to sentence case with the first character as a capital letter and the rest as lowercase. Sometimes maybe you might want to find the index position of a particular phrase or a character, and we can use name.index and it will tell us what position that is. This is built in. So instead of you working it out by doing a loop and selection statement, you can just use name.index, find the index of m, and it'll print that out for you. And we can also strip things out, where we can simply say remove the letter E from a particular string or something else, name.strip, and whatever's in the brackets is stripped out. Now there are a huge amount of other built-in functions, too many to know. The link can show you all of those. You can see that little link on screen. I will also put that in the description of this particular video so you can have a go at those. In the exam, you don't really need to use most of these. The only common ones are going to be lower, upper, capitalized, and so forth. Even the index one is too much. And with that, we bring the lesson to a close. Hopefully you've understood the use of procedures and functions and how everything is a function in Python. But if it returns a value, it's a true function, otherwise it acts as a procedure. You understood the use of built-in functions like length, input, print, how they're coded already, they're pre-tested, so you know they work. You understood the need for manipulating strings, why we need to join them, which is concatenation. We did that a couple of lessons ago, and how we can split strings and work out the individual parts. You also understand the use of separator characters like spaces and commas, and you can use those to split strings. Hopefully you use some common string manipulation functions. Now, if you haven't used those, which was the last particular section of this video, then I would suggest code them and have a go at utilizing them. And finally, you can code procedures or functions in programs and use them at your will. So make sure that you know that functions are reusable. So once you code them, they exist. And you can create functions which are local, only useful for your program, or you can create functions which are part of a program library and can be used across the board. So if you want to understand how to do that, which is beyond the scope of this particular syllabus, you can do a quick search online and you can find multiple videos that can guide you on how to do that, which will make your life very easy as a programmer because you don't need to code the same thing again and again and again. You can use the functions that you created now, maybe 10 years down the line, and they'll still work. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you've got any questions, as usual, post them in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.